"You know, old man, I don't think you belong here," Kyle said, his voice laced with condescension, the words barely escaping his smirk. The bar was buzzing with chatter and the clink of glasses, but his comment cut through the noise, bringing the room to a halt. He leaned forward, hands braced on the counter, eyeing the man seated at the far end of the bar. Jack, the Reaper, Hawk, the old man in question, was a figure many of the younger generation wouldn't recognize, but those who did, well, they knew better than to speak out of turn. Jack's eyes didn't leave the amber beer in front of him. He wasn't bothered by Kyle's words. In fact, he wasn't bothered by much anymore. At 75, the years had smoothed the rough edges of his life. But there was something in the air tonight, something almost electric. Kyle didn't know it, but he was walking into a storm. The young seal, brimming with arrogance, leaned in closer, his friends chuckling in the background. "So, tell me, old man, what's your call sign? Or do you even have one? But it's something like Grandpa, huh?" His laughter was sharp and dismissive. But Jack didn't react. He didn't even flinch. He just stared into his drink, letting the moment stretch into something uncomfortable. Kyle pressed on, the crowd's chuckles encouraging his bravado. "I'm serious. What is it? Dusty or something?" The words hung in the air like smoke. But instead of responding immediately, Jack took a slow sip of his beer, his old fingers steady as they gripped the glass. The room seemed to hold its breath, the seconds ticking by slowly. Finally, Jack looked up, his gaze cutting through Kyle's arrogant smile like a knife. His voice, though soft, carried the weight of someone who had seen it all. "The Reaper." For a moment, the entire bar froze. The sounds of chatter stopped. The laughter that had filled the air moments ago was now replaced with an eerie silence. Kyle's smirk faltered, his eyes narrowing in disbelief. His friends stopped laughing, glancing at each other in confusion. "The Reaper," Kyle repeated, trying to laugh it off, but his voice lacked the confidence it had moments earlier. "Yeah," Jack said, his gaze unwavering. "The Reaper." The name landed in the room like a hammer. The tension shifted, palpable in the air. Jack's words didn't just carry the weight of a nickname. They carried the weight of a man who had lived through things most of the people around him couldn't even imagine. As Jack spoke, a brief flash of memories stirred in his mind. Places he'd been, battles fought, lives lost and saved. He wasn't just a man in a bar. He was a legend, and it wasn't a name anyone gave lightly. Kyle stood frozen, his bravado slipping away like sand through his fingers. The crowd around him had gone eerily quiet, their curiosity piqued, their respect now instinctively growing. Kyle's friends, once so eager to mock the old man, now shifted uncomfortably, their eyes flicking from Jack to each other. There was something about the way Jack held himself, the stillness of his presence, that made them reconsider their assumptions. They couldn't place it, but they felt it. The Reaper wasn't just a call sign, it was a legacy. A small voice in Kyle's head whispered that he had just made a mistake, a big one. He could feel the weight of that silence now, the gravity of the moment settling over him. The man who sat before him wasn't some washed-up vet. He wasn't the butt of a joke. No, this was a man who had earned every ounce of respect he'd ever been given, and then some. Kyle swallowed hard, but before he could find the words to say, a voice interrupted him. "You know, Kyle," a deep voice rumbled from behind him. "Maybe you should step back and let the old man have his peace." A tall figure approached, an army veteran who had overheard the exchange. He recognized Jack. The room fell even quieter as the newcomer's words rang out. Kyle turned to face him, his face flushing as he realized the weight of what had just occurred. It was no longer a joke. Jack wasn't just a forgotten relic of war. He was someone who commanded respect, even from those who had once mocked him. Jack didn't say a word as the veteran placed a hand on his shoulder, silently validating the legend that Kyle had just begun to understand. And with that, the room fell into an uneasy silence. The kind of silence that only comes when the truth is laid bare and the game is up. Kyle was left standing there, his earlier arrogance now nothing more than a distant memory. He glanced at Jack one last time, the realization sinking in. He wasn't just a man. He was the Reaper. The room remained silent for a long moment. Kyle's heart raced in his chest, his earlier confidence now slipping away into a sea of uncertainty. He had expected laughter, maybe even some more jabs from his friends. But this silence was different. It was heavy, thick with a recognition he hadn't anticipated. The other patrons of the bar, who had once been too absorbed in their own conversations, now looked at Jack with a new understanding. The Reaper wasn't just a nickname. It was a reminder of everything that had come before. Kyle shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his mind working overtime. What kind of person was this man in front of him? His first instinct had been to belittle Jack, to make him the punchline of a joke. But now, as the room stayed frozen, he realized the mistake he had made. A sudden wave of embarrassment washed over him, his face flushing with regret. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words got stuck in his throat. It wasn't just Jack's presence that commanded the silence. It was the weight of everything he had carried with him, every step, every battle, every memory etched into his soul. Jack had lived a life most could never comprehend, and the call sign wasn't just a title, it was a legacy. And Kyle, for all his training and bravado, was just beginning to understand the depth of that. Then the voice behind him spoke again, low and steady. "You've made your point, Kyle. Now, maybe it's time to listen." It was the voice of Sergeant Mike Carter, an Army veteran who had been sitting nearby, overhearing the exchange. He was tall, with graying hair and the build of a man who had spent more time in the field than in an office. His presence seemed to fill the room, quieting even the few murmurs that had started. Kyle turned slowly to face him, but before he could say anything, Mike continued. "I've seen men like Jack before. Legends, you might say. Men who carried the weight of wars, of battles, of memories we'll never fully understand." The room seemed to lean in, every eye now on Mike. He took a step closer to Kyle, his tone now less authoritative and more reflective. "There's a reason they call him the Reaper. It's not just for show. It's because he's been through things that would have broken most men. He's seen things that would haunt anyone else for the rest of their lives. But Jack? He carries it with quiet strength." Kyle swallowed hard, his arrogance from earlier slowly being replaced by a growing sense of respect. He glanced at Jack, who was still sitting there, unbothered, as though the attention in the room didn't faze him. It was almost as if he was used to it, used to being underestimated, used to having people question him. Kyle suddenly realized that he wasn't just talking to some old man. He was talking to a man who had lived through hell and came out the other side with nothing more than his own story to tell. Kyle started, but his voice caught. Mike, sensing the shift, gave him a small nod. "You don't need to say anything. You'll understand when you get older. But for now, just know this. Respect isn't something that's given, Kyle. It's something that's earned." Kyle nodded, the words hitting him harder than any insult ever could. The whole bar had gone from uncomfortable laughter to quiet contemplation in the span of a few minutes. Kyle, now acutely aware of the man he had been mocking, shifted in his seat again. But this time, his eyes were filled with understanding, not disdain. Jack, however, remained unfazed. He took another sip of his beer, the faintest of smiles playing at the corners of his lips. His eyes seemed distant, as if the moment didn't need to be acknowledged. He had nothing to prove. As Kyle sat back in his chair, he couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. He had just learned one of the hardest lessons a person could learn. Never judge someone by their appearance, and never underestimate the power of someone's past. Jack had shown him that, and Kyle knew, in that moment, that he would never forget it. The silence in the bar stretched on, each second feeling heavier than the last. Kyle sat there, his fingers still gripping his glass, the cool condensation doing nothing to ease the heat rising in his cheeks. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him now, waiting for him to say something, anything. But the words wouldn't come. His usual sharp tongue, the one that had once sliced through every conversation, now felt dull, unable to find its edge. He looked over at Jack again, who remained calm, his expression unreadable. Jack's presence seemed to fill the space in a way that was almost tangible. It wasn't just his age or his history, it was the way he carried himself. There was no arrogance, no boastfulness. He didn't need to prove anything. He had nothing left to prove. The realization hit Kyle like a wave, drowning him in its simplicity. He had spent his entire life trying to prove himself, trying to make a name, to show the world what he was capable of. And here, sitting in front of him, was a man who had done it all, and more. A man whose name was a legend. A man who had earned the respect of everyone who truly mattered, and he had done it without saying a word. Kyle found himself wondering, for the first time, what it would be like to live like that. to have the kind of strength that didn't need to announce itself. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "You don't have to prove anything to me," Kyle finally said, the words almost coming out as a whisper. It wasn't much, but it was the most honest thing he had said all night. Jack's gaze never wavered, and for a moment, the two men just sat there, two very different lives connecting in a way Kyle hadn't expected. "It's not about proving anything, Kyle," Jack replied, his voice as calm and steady as ever. "It's about knowing who you are and being content with that. The world can throw all kinds of things at you, but if you know who you are, it doesn't matter." Kyle let the words sink in, feeling the weight of them settle deep within him. He had spent so much of his life trying to chase recognition, trying to prove his worth to the world, to his peers, to his superiors. But here was Jack, with his quiet wisdom, reminding him that true strength came from within, not from the applause of others. Kyle glanced around the bar, noticing the subtle shift in the atmosphere. People were still talking, but there was a new respect in the air, a new sense of quiet reverence. For the man sitting at the far end of the bar, no one had to say it, but they all knew. Jack was someone special. And in that moment, Kyle realized that the name, the Reaper, wasn't just about the battles Jack had fought. It was about the peace he had found within himself, a peace that had eluded Kyle for so long. The room slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but for Kyle, everything had changed. He sat there, lost in thought, realizing that sometimes, the most powerful thing a person could do wasn't to fight or to conquer, but to simply exist with quiet strength. He glanced at Jack once more, nodding slightly in silent acknowledgement. Jack, ever the stoic, nodded back. No words needed to be exchanged. The lesson had been learned, and for the first time, Kyle understood the true meaning of respect. The next few minutes passed in a strange kind of calm. Kyle could still feel the tension in his chest, but it was different now. The discomfort he'd been carrying around had shifted. The pride he'd once worn like armor was slowly crumbling, replaced by something unfamiliar. Jack's words echoed in his mind, repeating themselves like a quiet mantra. "It's not about proving anything. It's about knowing who you are." Kyle took a deep breath, trying to push away the remnants of his earlier bravado. He had spent years proving himself to others, but now, he wasn't so sure it mattered anymore. The world outside the bar seemed distant, as though the weight of everything that had been happening, his career, his training, his constant need for validation, had melted away into the background. He looked up again, his eyes catching Jack's steady gaze from across the table. "You really don't care what others think, do you?" Kyle asked, his voice softer now. Jack paused for a moment, considering the question. There was no hint of arrogance in his response, just a calm honesty that had become so rare in the world Kyle was used to. "I used to," Jack said quietly. "But after a while, you realize it doesn't matter. What matters is that you can look at yourself in the mirror and know you've done what you needed to do. That's all that counts." Kyle nodded slowly, taking in the simplicity of Jack's answer. It was a stark contrast to the complexity of the life he had led up until now. The expectations, the competition, the constant drive to be more, to be better. He had been chasing something, but he hadn't been sure what it was. Now, in the presence of this old man, he felt like he was beginning to understand. Kyle shifted in his seat, feeling an unfamiliar sense of peace starting to settle over him. "You know," he said, a hint of a smile playing at the corner of his mouth, "I've always thought being the best meant you had to be the loudest, the strongest, the one who stood out." Jack chuckled, a low, gravelly sound that made the corners of his eyes crinkle. "The loudest doesn't always mean the best, Kyle. It just means you're trying too hard to convince others of something. True strength is quiet. It's the kind of strength that doesn't need to scream for attention. It speaks for itself." Kyle let those words sink in. For the first time, he understood what Jack meant. It wasn't about proving something to the world. It was about proving it to yourself, in a way that didn't require external validation. He looked around the bar once more, and this time, the atmosphere felt different. People weren't just going through the motions anymore. They were aware, in their own subtle way, of the conversation happening at this table. No one was laughing, no one was mocking. The room had settled into a sense of respect, a quiet reverence that had nothing to do with rank or medals. It had everything to do with the quiet strength of one man sitting at the far end of the bar. As the night wore on, Kyle found himself drifting in and out of conversation, his thoughts constantly returning to what he had learned in the past hour. Jack was still there, seated calmly, sipping his beer, with no intention of leaving anytime soon. For a moment, Kyle wondered if Jack had ever really wanted the recognition he'd earned. But then, he realized, maybe Jack didn't need to wonder. He had already gotten everything he needed: peace, respect, and the satisfaction of knowing he had lived his life the right way. Kyle finished his drink, feeling a small shift inside him, something he couldn't quite explain. All he knew was that the next time he faced a challenge, he wouldn't do it to prove something to anyone else. He'd do it for himself. And in that, Jack had given him the greatest lesson of all. The night stretched on, and Kyle found himself lost in thought, the noise of the bar fading into the background. He wasn't sure when it had happened, but everything had shifted. The need to prove himself had somehow disappeared, replaced by something far more meaningful. Jack, as always, was calm, unbothered by the world around him, his attention focused on his drink as though nothing had changed. And yet, for Kyle, everything had. He found himself wondering how Jack had gotten here, how he had come to this place of quiet strength. The stories must have been endless, each one a testament to a life lived with purpose, with meaning. Kyle glanced at the man again, this time with a newfound sense of respect. "You ever think about the past?" Kyle asked, his voice low, almost hesitant. Jack didn't immediately respond. Instead, he took a slow sip from his glass, his gaze never leaving the amber liquid swirling inside. For a moment, Kyle thought he hadn't heard the question. But then Jack's voice broke the silence, soft but steady. "All the time," he said, his words carrying a weight that Kyle could feel in his chest. "But I don't live there anymore. The past is a part of me, but it's not who I am now." Kyle nodded slowly, taking in the simplicity of Jack's words. It was something he'd never quite understood before. How someone could move past the things that had shaped them without letting those things define them. "So how do you do it?" Kyle asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How do you let go?" Jack's gaze finally shifted from his drink, meeting Kyle's eyes for the first time in what felt like hours. There was no pity in his look, no judgment, just understanding. "You don't let go all at once," Jack replied. "You let go piece by piece, as you grow. The key is not to hold on to the things that weigh you down. The rest of it, you carry with you, and you use it to shape who you are today." Kyle thought about this for a moment. He had spent so much of his life holding onto the weight of expectations, trying to be someone he thought he had to be. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to let go of that. Maybe the person he was supposed to be had already been inside him all along, waiting to be uncovered. Jack's voice broke through his thoughts again. "It's not about forgetting," Jack said, his voice steady and strong. "It's about choosing to move forward with the strength you've gained from everything you've been through. We're not defined by our past, Kyle. We're defined by how we rise from it." Kyle let these words sink in, letting them wash over him, filling the spaces inside him that had once felt empty. It was as if, for the first time, he was seeing the world through a different lens. The weight of his past no longer seemed so heavy, and the future didn't feel as uncertain as it once had. For the first time in a long time, he felt free. He glanced at Jack, who had already turned his attention back to his drink. "Thanks," Kyle said quietly, the words feeling right for the first time in a long time. Jack looked at him, and for a moment, the two men just shared a silent understanding. There was no need for more words. The lesson had been learned. The weight had been lifted. And for the first time in his life, Kyle was ready to move forward, not to prove anything to anyone, but to simply be the person he had always been meant to be. The following days passed in a blur for Kyle. He found himself replaying the conversation with Jack over and over in his mind, each time understanding a little more. It was strange how something so simple could change everything. But that was exactly what had happened. He still didn't know exactly who he was, but he felt like he was on the right path now. The need for validation, the drive to be recognized, it all seemed so far away. It wasn't that he didn't care anymore. It was that he realized he didn't need the world's approval to be content. One afternoon, about a week after that night at the bar, Kyle found himself back at the same spot, though this time he wasn't alone. The bar was quieter than usual, with only a few patrons scattered around. Kyle had been by himself, reflecting on everything that had happened, when the familiar face appeared again. Jack walked in, his slow, steady steps unmistakable. Kyle nodded to him as he entered, and Jack returned the gesture, making his way to the same spot by the window where they had sat before. Without thinking, Kyle stood up and made his way over to him. He was surprised to find that he felt a strange sense of purpose in his movement, as though the tension in his chest had finally melted away, leaving only calm. "Mind if I join you?" Kyle asked, his voice steady and sincere. Jack looked up, his eyes sharp as they met Kyle's. He seemed to pause for a moment, as though weighing the question in his mind. Then, with a slight nod, he gestured to the seat across from him. "Take a seat," Jack said, his voice low but welcoming. Kyle sat down, feeling like he was stepping into something different, something more genuine. There was no pressure to impress or prove anything, only the quiet hum of understanding between the two men. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," Kyle began, his eyes on Jack's face. "About letting go. About not holding on to everything that weighs you down." Jack listened, his face unreadable, but there was something in his posture, something that said he was truly hearing Kyle. "I'm still figuring it out," Kyle continued, his hands fidgeting with the glass in front of him. "But I feel like I'm starting to get it." Jack nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "It's not an easy thing to do," he said. "Letting go of the past takes time. But it's worth it. You don't have to forget. You just need to stop letting it control you." Kyle leaned back in his chair, feeling the truth of those words sink in. It wasn't about forgetting the hardships, the mistakes, or the regrets. It was about no longer letting them dictate who he was. The past was a part of him, yes, but it didn't have to define his future. "I'm trying," Kyle admitted. "I really am. It's just hard sometimes." Jack looked at him, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Nothing worth doing is easy. But that's the thing. You don't have to do it all at once. Just take it one step at a time." Kyle's smile matched Jack's, a sense of understanding passing between them. For the first time in a long time, Kyle felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. Not just physically, but mentally. He wasn't running from anything anymore. He wasn't trying to outrun the past. He was just living. "Thanks, Jack," Kyle said, the gratitude in his voice genuine. "For everything." Jack simply nodded, his smile never fading. "Don't mention it, kid. Just keep moving forward. That's all anyone can do." They sat in silence for a while after that, not needing to say anything more. The world outside the bar continued on, but inside, everything felt different. Kyle felt like he was finally on the path he had been meant to walk all along. The weeks that followed felt different for Kyle. He had been back to the bar a few times since that night with Jack, each visit bringing with it a quiet sense of understanding. His interactions with others were changing, too. He wasn't looking for approval anymore. Instead, he was learning to trust his own instincts, and for the first time, those instincts felt strong. It wasn't just a mental shift. It was physical, too. The weight on his shoulders, the constant tension he had carried around for so long, had started to ease. Kyle was beginning to realize that true strength came from within, not from how others saw you. One afternoon, after a long day at the gym, Kyle found himself walking to the bar again. This time, he wasn't seeking answers. He wasn't even sure what he was looking for, but something inside told him it was time to sit down and talk to Jack once more. When he entered, the familiar quiet hum of the bar greeted him, and there, in his usual spot, was Jack. Kyle approached him, feeling more confident than he had in a long time. "Mind if I join you again?" he asked, his voice steady. Jack looked up, his face unreadable for a moment before a slight smile tugged at the corners of his lips. "I was wondering when you'd be back," Jack said, motioning for Kyle to sit. "Seems like you've been doing some thinking." Kyle chuckled softly as he sat down. "Yeah, I guess you could say that." The two men exchanged a look of mutual understanding. No words were needed. "I'm not sure if I'm doing this the right way," Kyle said. After a moment, his tone thoughtful. "I've been trying to let go, like you said. But there are days when I feel like I'm still holding on to something, like it's just waiting for me to slip up." Jack listened carefully, his eyes steady as they met Kyle's. "Letting go doesn't mean you won't have bad days, Kyle," Jack replied. "It just means you stop letting those days control you. The key is knowing that even on the worst days, you're still moving forward. It's not about perfection. It's about progress." Kyle nodded, taking in Jack's words. It was simple, but it made sense. "Progress," Kyle repeated, the word tasting different in his mouth now. It wasn't about achieving some perfect state or meeting every expectation. It was about getting better each day, even if it was just by a little. "Yeah," Jack said, a knowing look in his eyes. It's about taking one step at a time. And it's about being kind to yourself along the way. You've been through a lot. You don't need to carry all of that at once. Let it go when you're ready. Kyle felt a sense of relief wash over him. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel rushed or pressured to get everything figured out. He didn't need to have all the answers right now. What mattered was that he was trying, and that in itself was enough. As the conversation drifted into a more comfortable silence, Kyle realized something. The need to prove himself had faded, but in its place, something much stronger had emerged. He didn't need to be the loudest or the fastest. He didn't need anyone's approval. What mattered was that he could look at himself in the mirror and know he was doing his best. For the first time in a long time, Kyle felt at peace with who he was, and he knew that he was on the right path. Jack's wisdom had shown him that it wasn't about achieving perfection. It was about accepting who he was, flaws and all, and continuing to move forward. As the night wore on, Kyle found himself smiling more than he had in ages. Not because he had all the answers, but because he had found something much more important: the freedom to live his life without the constant weight of expectation holding him down. The days that followed felt like a slow unfolding for Kyle. He found himself thinking back to his conversations with Jack, each one a piece of a puzzle that had slowly started to make sense. He wasn't sure when it had happened, but he felt different now, lighter, freer. He had stopped searching for validation from others, and for the first time, he felt like he was walking his own path. He didn't have to compete with anyone. He didn't have to be the best. He just had to be true to himself. One evening, Kyle decided to pay another visit to the bar. The place had become a quiet refuge for him, a space where he could let his thoughts settle and process everything that had changed. When he walked in, the familiar hum of conversations surrounded him, but his attention immediately found Jack, sitting in his usual spot. There was something about Jack that always seemed to exude calm, like he had a peace that came from somewhere deeper than just years lived. Kyle walked over and sat down without asking this time, the motion feeling more natural than ever before. Jack glanced at him and offered a nod, a silent greeting that Kyle appreciated more than words. "I've been thinking about that idea you mentioned," Kyle said, breaking the quiet. "You know, about not needing to prove anything to anyone. It's harder than I thought it would be." Jack gave him a small smile, a knowing glint in his eyes. "It always is," he said simply. "It's not a switch you can flip. It's a process, a journey. And it takes time." Kyle ran a hand through his hair, feeling a familiar frustration bubbling up. "But I thought I was making progress. Some days, it feels like I've got it all together, and other days, it feels like I'm back at square one." Jack's smile didn't waver, but there was a quiet understanding in his eyes. "That's how it goes," he said. "The trick is not to let those setbacks define you. You'll have good days and bad days. It's about the direction you're heading, not the occasional stumble." Kyle nodded, taking in Jack's words. He had started to realize that growth wasn't linear. It wasn't about being perfect every day, but about showing up, doing your best, and learning from each step. He had expected this journey to be neat, to have a clear path. But life wasn't like that. It was messy, unpredictable, and full of challenges. And that was okay. "I think I get it," Kyle said, his voice more confident than it had been in a long time. "It's not about the destination, it's about the journey. Even when it's hard, I just have to keep going." Jack nodded approvingly, as though he had been waiting for Kyle to come to that realization on his own. "Exactly," he said. "You're getting it. The journey is where the growth happens. And the important thing is that you keep moving forward, no matter how small the steps may seem." Kyle sat back in his chair, the weight of those words sinking in. It felt like a burden had been lifted, like he no longer had to carry the pressure of getting everything right all the time. He could take it one day at a time, one step at a time. And that was enough. The world around him seemed a little brighter, a little more manageable, as he embraced the idea that perfection was not the goal. The goal was progress, and progress, no matter how slow, was enough. "Thanks, Jack," Kyle said quietly, the gratitude in his voice genuine. Jack nodded once again, his smile calm and reassuring. "Anytime, kid. Anytime." The night passed in a comfortable silence, the two men sitting together in the easy companionship that had come to define their conversations. Kyle had learned a lot in the time he'd spent with Jack, but it was moments like these, the quiet, unspoken understanding, that taught him the most. He had found a peace within himself that he hadn't known he was searching for, and it felt good. Realizing that the only person he needed to prove anything to was himself had been a revelation. And now, he could move forward, no longer weighed down by expectations, but free to simply be. He didn't have all the answers, and he knew there would still be difficult days ahead. But for the first time, he was okay with that. He didn't need to have everything figured out. He just needed to keep moving forward. As the days turned into weeks, Kyle found himself slowly slipping into a new rhythm. He wasn't rushing anymore. The sense of urgency that had once consumed him was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence. He didn't need to prove himself to anyone, and the weight of expectation no longer hung over him. Every day felt like a step forward, even the difficult ones. He found peace in the small victories, the moments when he could just be, without worrying about where he was headed or whether he was measuring up to someone else's standard. Jack had been right all along. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about progress. One evening, Kyle walked into the bar once more, this time with a lighter heart. It wasn't that he had everything figured out, but he knew he was on the right track. As he entered, the familiar murmur of conversation filled the air, and there, in his usual spot, was Jack. The old man didn't look any different, but Kyle could see it now. Jack's quiet strength was a beacon, not just for others, but for himself. Kyle approached and sat down, and Jack offered him a slight nod, his silent greeting as always. "How's it going, kid?" Jack asked, his voice low but warm. Kyle smiled, feeling the weight of the question more than usual. "Better than I expected," he said honestly. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about how it's all about progress, not perfection." Jack's eyes twinkled slightly as he nodded. "Good to hear. How's it feel, not chasing after perfection?" Kyle took a moment, leaning back in his chair, allowing himself to fully consider the question. It was different, he realized. He no longer felt like he had to outrun his past or prove his worth with every move. He was just living, and that felt more than enough. "It feels freeing," Kyle said after a moment. "Like I've finally stopped running." Jack gave him a knowing smile, but said nothing, allowing the silence between them to settle comfortably. It was strange how much could be said without words. Kyle had learned so much in the time they had spent together, but what he appreciated most was the simplicity of Jack's wisdom. There was no rush, no need for explanations. The lessons were in the way Jack lived, in the way he carried himself. "I've been thinking," Kyle said after a while, "about how easy it is to get lost in the need for approval, especially in a place like this. Everyone's always measuring themselves against others. But I don't want to live like that anymore. I want to do things because I believe in them, not because I need someone else to see my worth." Jack looked at him with quiet pride. "That's the right way to think. The rest of the world might not always see what you're doing, but as long as you know it matters, that's all that matters. No one else can define your success, Kyle. Only you can." Kyle nodded, feeling the truth of those words settle deep within him. He wasn't sure what the future would hold, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid of it. He didn't need to have all the answers, and he didn't need to be the best. He just needed to keep moving forward, one step at a time. The conversation drifted to other things, sports, memories, quiet reflections on life, but Kyle didn't mind the silence that had settled between them. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that comes with understanding. And as he sat there with Jack, surrounded by the usual hum of the bar, Kyle realized something important. He wasn't running from anything anymore. He wasn't trying to prove himself. He was simply living, and for the first time, that felt like enough.